Hello and thank you for watching. My name is Heather Alexandra, and today we're going to talk about graphics in Nier Automata and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. So, Nier and Zelda have been my video game poisons of choice lately. I can't get enough of these games. One is a wild science fiction slash fest jam-packed with philosophy and really cool robots, and the other is just about the most adventurous feeling game that I've ever played. I've had a blast playing these games, but from time to time I'll catch graphical or performance hiccups that will draw me out of what's otherwise a really great experience. And I've been forced to examine how these games handle their technical shortcomings, and I've observed two different conclusions from each game. Before we begin, I just want to note that I'm not really into technical criticism or analysis usually. Whenever I see a Digital Foundry comparison post between PC and Xbox and PS4, I don't really care, and when people talk to me about God rays or FXAA, my eyes kind of glaze over. But the ways that these two games have approached their graphical limitations has been really interesting to me. We'll start with Breath of the Wild. This is kind of the more straightforward case. It has a really vast game world that lends itself to exploration, but it often runs into small problems. Areas with high foliage will drop frame rate, textures don't really hold up to close scrutiny. When you're heading around the game world, trees and enemies sometimes pop into existence, and there's noticeable aliasing. But because of the game's style, I don't really care. It's clear to me that Breath of the Wild is really conscious of its technical limitations. It's a launch title on new hardware that wasn't even really planned to be on that system when it was first pitched. And to pack so much into the game, visual sacrifices had to be made, and stylization became the name of the game instead. Breath of the Wild lacks the drastic art direction of a game like Wind Waker, or even some of the other touches that you might see in Skyward Sword, but it does amble down the road of stylization to a fair degree. Characters and creatures in the game world have this noticeably messy quality to them, almost like they were quickly molded out of clay or maybe hastily painted over. But this messiness is consistent throughout the game space. It's all throughout the world. It's not just in the creatures, it's in the people you meet, the buildings that you encounter, the ruins that you climb through, and the rocky cliffs that you are always jumping off of. And because of this, while graphical shortcomings might draw the eye from time to time, they never really threaten the experience because the rules of the world are consistent throughout. You can go from Death Mountain to the desert to the windswept icy tundra, and the game always feels distinct, but the style remains the same throughout. Lacking a clear attempt at fidelity that games like Skyrim or Horizon Zero Dawn might have, Zelda sidesteps being hampered by its technical limitations through a clear style and aesthetic that's applied consistently throughout the game space. So, if a consistent style and visual rule set is one way to address technical limitations or hardware restrictions, what's the other? Well, this is a bit more abstract and kind of pretentious, but I hope you'll follow me on this one. In this case, it's themes. Nier Automata is a game that's concerned with a few fundamental concepts. Among these is issues of dual identity, the breakdown of society, limits of artificial life, and the blurred lines between physical existence and the digital self. In some cases, these themes are expressed cogently through the gameplay. Shifts in camera perspective or even character perspective stress the idea that our perception of the game world and the story is mutable. It's changeable. There's a sense that things can break down or reform based upon our growing knowledge and information. When playing as 9S, we can hack into enemies to fight them, and that highlights the thin line between the real world and digital spaces. These spaces are destructible, and they can blink in and out of existence with too much pressure. Immediately, this begins to toss meaning into any graphics abnormalities that we encounter in Nier Automata. In the overworld, I often found myself looking at buildings that would gain a severe lack of definition as I moved away. They would kind of look like they were from PS2 games. But because the game is already stressing the fragility of digital spaces within its fiction, we can begin to see that fragility reflected in the actual game space when we encounter these visual shorthands and shortcomings. Functionally, the shifts in perspective and changes in environmental details begin to call to mind the game's focus on shifting worlds, redefining spaces, and decay. This is a world far after the end, where technology has been forced to adapt and survive beyond expectations. When I walk through the overworld and spy incongruities in the game's fidelity, it often feels in line with the messages that Nier Automata is trying to communicate. There's also a postmodern quality to consider. Self-reference isn't necessarily a hallmark of postmodern work. Postmodernism has just as much to do with skepticism towards certain ideals that rose during the height of great empires and a bunch of other stuff, but the use of self-referential content within Nier Automata does help establish it as a postmodern text. Tongue-in-cheek bad endings poke fun at the narrative and the player's ability to throw it into confusion, and a preoccupation with game systems and interfaces highlights the boundaries between the game world and the real world, the world that we inhabit. Automata is a game that's concerned with rejecting grand ideas like rationality or an idealized humanity, and by calling attention to the form of the game, it questions the validity of its own construction, and it also sort of undercuts the player's power by portraying it as something fickle or changeable. When a texture fails to load or an area stutters as a new chunk of it is being fetched from memory, Automata, intentionally or not, calls attention to itself in a way that still falls in line with the game's tendencies to point out its own fragility. And yeah, a lot of this sounds like I'm bending over to dismiss a few poor textures, and maybe that's true. After all, a strange-looking bit of graphics isn't always something really profound. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and a glitch can just be a glitch. I mean, I get that. But examining how Breath of the Wild and Nier Automata managed to avoid being crippled or weighed down by their technical shortcomings helps us understand the ways that games are more important and more powerful than just the visuals. Consistent art direction and narrative design go a really long way to imbuing even the accidental with meaning. And these two games are a wonderful case study in how, if you have one solid core concept, very little can hold you back.